Okay, so let's get going on the second talk. There is a handout for this as well. So if you don't have a handout, maybe wave your hand and hopefully one of the organizers can get you a handout. So we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the totally unnecessary. Or generally unnecessary. There are always exceptions. So there's tons and tons and tons of fertilizers out there, and I even get confused when I'm looking at all the different things at the big box stores or wherever, because how do you even know where to start in terms of what you choose? So I kind of take it from getting away from the big box stores and finding out what you actually need. And then that makes your choice a lot easier, because if you're looking for something very specific, there's not as many choices as there are without being specific. So I'm going to talk about gardens and landscapes as being different, because they are, than agriculture production, which is caring for a monocultural crop and looking for maximizing yield. That's the whole point of agriculture, maximizing yield of a crop, usually monocultural. And we're going to be looking at peer-reviewed literature. We're not looking at what tradition says. We're not looking at common sense. We're looking at the science and seeing what the science suggests. So this is kind of small. I apologize for that, but it's a chart that kind of looks at differences among different agricultural systems, with first intensive agriculture, that being the monocultural crop, compared to a home vegetable garden, which we're not talking about, but it's kind of in between that and the last thing, which is the ornamental landscape. And so for the purposes of this talk, what we know is that nutrient inputs for agriculture are high, because they have to be, because you're removing everything after harvest, right? And then planting something else, probably working in some amendments, because that's how we do ag. And then when you're looking at a landscape, it's low, because landscapes recycle the majority of their nutrients, especially if the various things like fallen leaves and grass clippings are left on site and not taken away. When we look at landscapes, comparing yield, when we look at agricultural yield, we're trying to maximize yield. That's why we have lots of nutrients. That's why we have lots of disturbance. And then when we're getting down to landscapes, we're trying to sustain a permanent landscape, not an annual crop. So we're going to compare. There's two different things, which is why we can't use ag recommendations for landscapes. And I think most soil testing now, or many of the labs do have a checkbox, so you can let them know that you are doing landscape analysis. Just don't not tell them and then assume that they're going to give you stuff that's relevant to a landscape, because they're quite different. So what do we need for plant success? We've got to have functional roots for taking up things, and that's a whole other topic. We have the macronutrients, and we know that especially for ag production, that's NPK, although you can find the NPK signs all over the place for fertilizers that are meant for landscapes. We need micronutrients as well as the macronutrients. We need water and oxygen, and we need the beneficial microbes. And this is an important point, because imbalances in the fertilizer in the soil can cause a decrease in your beneficial microbes. So, what a fertilizer is, from a legal standpoint, is something that has a guaranteed analysis. So fertilizers and their approval by the state departments of ag have to have this guaranteed analysis that says exactly what's in it. So that's the good thing. You know what's in it. There may be things that aren't there that you don't have to analyze for. And I get concerned about things like heavy metals, for instance. There's no guarantee that they're going to tell you what heavy metals are there that you maybe don't want, but that's where a soil test can come in handy. Okay, so this is why these things kind of act in concert. So commercial fertilizers, even though lots of people don't like them because they see them as being unnatural, are good because they have a guaranteed analysis. So this one is a 20-10-20, and that's the NPK. Biostimulants, for all the marketing, are not really fertilizers, and that's because they don't have enough nutrients in them to be considered to be fertilizers. They have lots of marketing, but they don't have much in the way of nutrient content. So there was an excellent paper several years ago, I should get a picture of it and put it up, by Glenn Percival, who does a lot of this kind of product testing, who looked at Super Thrive and a lot of these other quote biostimulants and found that they basically don't do anything because it's just water with some things thrown into it. And oftentimes water is all plants need, but then you're fooled into thinking it's the biostimulant. Then there's the homemade fertilizers, and it's just a jar of brown water. You don't know what it is. You have no idea what's in this. And lots of homeowners like to use homemade fertilizers because they like to cook or whatever they like to do. They like to make things themselves, but you don't know what's in it. So they're really dangerous to use because they can have, ungodly amounts of some nutrient in there that you don't need. So we have the problems of overuse and misuse. So we talked about this last time, the whole issue with imbalances or toxicities, where you've got too much of something that causes problem. Again, here's our picture, the poster child for intervenal chlorosis. So you can have imbalances causing the nutrient uptake disruption. It also has negative effects on beneficial microbes. So we'll talk about that. And then there's contaminants in many things that are not regulated. The contaminants can be things like heavy metals. Kelp fertilizers, for instance, almost always have high levels of heavy metals because kelp fertilizers, or kelp, just collect heavy metals. Just something they do. Why? Not sure. It may be an anti-herbivore mechanism. Nobody's really quite sure. Pathogens in manures. And this is sometimes you'll get something that, where a cow is, or a horse or whoever has eaten something that's been treated with herbicides, which doesn't hurt the animal, but then the manure has high levels of persistent herbicides, and then you have things that die because of contaminated manure. Coffee grounds, which is a favorite for using compost piles, they have high levels of plant inhibitors. And so if you have too much coffee ground in a mix, then you'll have issues with plant survival. And then pesticides leading contaminated compost. And several years ago, there was a problem in the east side of Washington State where they grow a lot of hay and other types of grasses, grains. And they, of course, treat it with broadleaf killers like clopyralid. Oh, it's too early in the morning. Clopyralid. And that's persistent, right? So they treat with that, and then the residues got carted up and taken to make compost on the west side of the mountains, and then people put it down and immediately killed many, if not all, of their plants that were broadleaf plants. So you have to be really careful of that too. That was a huge scandal. It wasn't really a scandal, but it was a huge problem for the compost industry because all of a sudden now they're selling stuff that's killing plants. So those are things just to be aware of. So the first thing to think about is what types of fertilizers is there absolutely no good information supporting their use in the scientific literature. This includes balanced fertilizers, cold hardiness fertilizers, compost tea, kelp products, and vitamin B1. So these are things that often get added during transplant as annual types of management, but there's nothing in the literature that supports their use. And in fact, there's things that actually would suggest you don't use them. And then there's a practice called fertilizer injection, which also falls into the same thing, where there's no consistent, reliable supporting science that would make you want to use the practice. So what a balanced fertilizer is, if you're not aware, is something that has equal portions of NPK. So it's 10-10-10, and this is out there on the web. This is what you want to do for your gardens and landscapes. You want to use equal portions, a complete fertilizer, so that you're meeting all of your plants' needs. So nitrogen is said to be needed for leafy growth, phosphate for flower and seed development, and potassium for roots and disease resistance. They do many other things, but those are some of the simple things that get marketed as why you have to add them, without ever the caveat that you should have a soil test done first before you add anything. So with these fertilizers, you again get the imbalances and toxicities, the nutrient disruption, the negative effect, especially on things like mycorrhizae, which really do poorly in high phosphate conditions, and possibly other types of nutrients in high levels, and heavy metal buildup. So you may not worry about heavy metals, but the problem with heavy metals is they're elemental. Once they're in your soil, they are there to stay. They don't get broken down. It's an element. So you keep on using it, and you build up that level of heavy metal in your soil. Micronutrients are exactly what the name says, micro, very small amounts. So you don't have to have large amounts of copper, iron, magnesium, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, or zinc. Small amounts, they're not macronutrients, they're micronutrients. So you don't need to worry about things that market themselves as being this great source of iron or magnesium, because your soil test will tell you how much you need, and it's a micronutrient. You don't need a whole lot. So again, use the soil test as your guide. If it says above optimum, don't add anything. If you have a client that wants you to add something, add water and nitrogen. You can't really go wrong with either one. And at least then you're adding something and making them happy. But don't add any nutrients that aren't in the very low range of a soil test. So potassium and magnesium fertilizers are marketed not necessarily in garden centers or any place else, but they're marketed online as being things that will increase cold hardiness. Now, where this comes from, I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I've actually gone into the literature to look because my PhD research was on cold hardiness and the factors that improve cold hardiness. So this is something that I'm supposed to know a lot about, and I'd never heard of either of these things helping cold hardiness. But so we're going to get into it to figure out why. So potassium, sometimes just called wood ash. A lot of your clients may not, they'll know what wood ash is, but they're not really sure about potassium. It's basically, the same thing. What potassium does, one of the important things it does is it regulates cell water content. So, the little stomates that open and close, potassium is the ion that regulates if the stomates are open or closed. So they open to let gas out or gas in. Water also goes out. During droughts, normally the stomates are closed. But potassium regulates that. Potassium is rarely deficient, but you don't know unless you have a soil test. And adding more potassium when you have enough potassium is not going to help. If it says it's optimum, it's optimum. If it says it's low, it's probably enough unless you ground truth it and see that there are problems, and it's not likely. So here's the research. There's been some, because there's this belief out there that magnesium and potassium will do this. And with potassium, they've gotten mixed results, because knowing that potassium regulates stomatal opening and closing, and that also having stomates open or closed can affect the cold hardiness of the tissue, then maybe potassium would have something to do with it. But most studies found no effect, didn't change the cold hardiness of the plants at all. Some studies actually found a negative effect, so it made the problem worse. But nothing suggested, yes, it will help them become more cold hardy. Nobody found that. So that's the best you can say. It was mixed results, but it was either bad or worse. I mean, it was either no effect or worse. So the science behind potassium and magnesium, we know that potassium is going to function at the cell membrane level. It controls stomates. Magnesium functions as an enzyme cofactor, which means it helps a lot of the enzymes do their work, whether it's in photosynthesis or something else. Both nutrients together are generally not deficient in soils. So the soil test is the first place you take your client to say, we've got enough potassium, have enough magnesium, we don't need to add any. It's not going to make cold hardiness any better. They actually can interfere with each other because they're both positively charged. So they're part of the whole cation exchange capacity, right, in the soils. So that it can mess with the CEC if they get to be too high. They interfere with each other and interfere with other cations in the soil. And with the research that's been done, there's no established connection with, either potassium or magnesium's not on that one. I think we just had it here for potassium because there's actually been no real research looking at magnesium. But you can see here from the type of fertilizers used, the NPK, that was done with K, with the fertilizers, showed increased well, actually, so this one showed increased hardiness in 9, decreased hardiness in 1, and no effect in 6. And I remember going back and looking at the ones where they did the increased hardiness, and they were not field tests, they were lab tests. So it was not something that would really be extrapolated to field conditions. So we know that neither potassium or magnesium will increase landscape plant hardiness. So what you want to do, if you have people that are convinced that this is that they need this or something, is that you're going to keep your marginally hardy species in things that are protected, that don't get cold winds in the winter. So on the leeward side of buildings or things like that. I lived in Buffalo, and so we dealt with this all the time. That's one way to help protect your plants. And the other way is to protect the root zone by having a decent layer of wood chips, because that will moderate soil temperatures and prevent a lot of the freezing that occurs on bare soils. And just make sure you test your soils and know that you have enough potassium and magnesium. So if it says you're above optimum, don't add any more. Okay, compost tea. This is actually one of the very first things I wrote a myth column on, was compost tea, and it still is out there. It's been over 25 years and it's still out there. So you're told that improved soil enhances plant growth. And then there's this great diagram from somebody online who sells compost tea, and this is from, I don't remember which gardens in, here we go. This is from the park over the Big Dig in Boston. So the one on the left is before compost tea use, and the one on the other side, the boxwood, is after compost tea use. What else can you see that's different in those two pictures? Seasons. Boxwood turns orange in the winter. It's a cold hardiness adaptation. It's not damaged. It turns orange. In the summer, it'll be green, just like the leaves on the trees. So it's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors and marketing, and there's absolutely no truth to this. But it's out there, so we have to know however they say, in order to beat your enemy, you have to understand them, right? And I'm not saying compost tea is my enemy, but to defeat the myths, you've got to understand them. So the theory is that you've got all these beneficial microbes in the compost. It's going to jumpstart the soil biology. And then there's all kinds of little diagrams about how wonderful it is. And one of my colleagues who was at University of Minnesota and did that work on the trees and the wood chips, his response to this is, what happens to all those beneficial microbes when you strip them out of their food source? Because now you're taking the microbes, you're removing them from their food source, and they're putting them on bare soil to jumpstart soil biology. There's nothing for them to eat. The compost would do it, but the microbes need something to eat. And so jumpstarting soil biology suggests the soil is lifeless. Adding microbes is not going to help. So there is some science. Well, actually, there's tons of research on aerobic compost tea, that's the ACT, and soils. So very few studies have positive results in terms of, yes, it had a vast improvement in all these nutrients or some other soil characteristic. The best study came from a researcher who's in Wisconsin, who looked at every possible thing that the soils, how they could change, and found that dilute compost tea was no different than water in terms of its nutrient content, which is pretty funny because water doesn't contain any nutrients. And the concentrated aerobic compost tea had a few differences, but keep in mind I'm saying concentrated here, and that's not what's recommended to apply. So there's recipes, as you all know. So this is the concentrate that you're supposed to dilute, but the dilute doesn't have anything. And what he said in his research was that it was so expensive to use the concentrated stuff that it would be several thousands of dollars to treat each tree in their study site, and only a few differences, and not in anything like nitrogen or anything like that. And they didn't even get into the whole issue, do you need more nutrients? Not having a soil test done. And so what his suggestion was, which most researchers suggest, is that you use the compost and not a compost tea because it's got more nutrients, many more microbes. In fact, he measured everything in the compost as well as the compost tea. This is something nobody else had ever done, and found orders of magnitude more of everything. Nutrients, beneficial nematodes, the microbes themselves. So why not just use the compost and save yourself the hassle of brewing the tea? Where the science is the strongest is someplace where we really don't want it to be strong, and that's in human health concerns. And it turns out that aerated compost tea can contain both E. coli, which it's not nearly as fun as that little creature is, and salmonella, also not a fun thing. But I love the fact that they make little stuffies that are pathogens. Yard waste actually has more pathogens than manure, which was really kind of surprising considering when manure is source, and you'd think yard waste would not, but there's all kinds of things in yard waste. And molasses actually makes things worse. So all these additives you're supposed to add to feed the tea, it will feed the pathogens as well. And there's, a pretty robust body of science behind the human health concerns part. So anyway, what we can say is that ACTs don't have any type of consistent value as a fertilizer. They're not registered fertilizers because every batch is different because it's a very complex population of microbes that you're working with. None of them are the same. They can contain pathogens, and they're expensive and energy wasteful to produce. So there's no good reason, but people like it because it has emotional appeal. Because they call it compost tea when researchers were studying it but not recommending it, they called it compost leachate. You can't sell and market compost leachate, but you can certainly market and sell compost tea. Okay, on to kelps and seaweeds. Again, another one of these things that just really appeals to people emotionally, that you can go out and you can collect your kelps and you can use that as a natural fertilizer. And there's all kinds of things online that will explain to you how to do this with really photogenic models. And you're told if you do this, it will stimulate root growth and plant establishment. So one thing you may not know about me is my master's degree is actually in marine biology. So I have a real passion for the intertidal system, which is where kelps live. And they are the trees of the intertidal system. And when you remove them, you create underwater deserts. And this was so bad in Puget Sound, which is up where I live, which is a saltwater body, is that people would go in and just basically clear cut these areas, which was illegal at the time anyway. Now it's even more illegal, if that can be, it's more expensive if you get caught, let's put it that way. That these areas would not be colonized by animals for years after they'd been cleared. It takes a while for these kelps to regenerate. And so all the fish and everything else that feed on the things that feed on the kelp would go someplace else. And there's been much research on this to show that the kelps are critical in seabird populations, fish populations, anything that you might harvest or enjoy in the ocean really requires these kelp forests. So, if you have kelp, if you're growing it commercially and you do it in your own system so that it's being farmed as opposed to being clear cut, I have no real problem with it from that perspective. But in terms of stuff that's collected in the wild, I have a serious problem. So there's a lot of research on kelps as a fertilizer. It is a weak fertilizer. Any plant material is a weak fertilizer, right? Because they all contain the nutrients that plants need. So anything that's made out of plants is a weak fertilizer. As I mentioned on the last talk, it can contain heavy metals because kelps just collect heavy metals, possibly as a way to keep herbivores away. But more importantly, from your perspective, when they compare them to well-watered, traditionally fertilized plants, there are no differences, okay? So if you use a fertilizer and you know exactly what it is and what you need, that you can use it and keeping things well watered, and they will do just as well, if not better, than the kelps. And the kelps, sometimes they'll tell you what the analysis is, sometimes they won't. They rarely will tell you, well, of course they're not going to tell you if it has toxic heavy metals in it because then you wouldn't buy it. because they're not required to tell you that it has toxic heavy metals. So there's just no really good reason to use it. And there's a lot of good reasons to just leave them in place. So again, a peer-reviewed fact sheet from Washington State Extension that talks about it in a lot more detail than I'm giving you here, but it can be something that you can run off and share with your clients. And I should point out that the work I do for Extension is not regional. I don't do things for a county or for the state. I mean, I do, but it's applicable to any place, not just Washington State. Okay, vitamin B1, this is short. You don't need to use transplant fertilizers for vitamin B1 because plants make their own. So anytime you see vitamin B1 plus whatever, chelated iron, zinc, and manganese, which you may not need, for transplanting. If you're doing, root dips or something, rather than using vitamin B1, use rooting hormones. That's what works. That's how plants make their own roots. And rooting hormones are effective, science-based. Whether they're naturally occurring or whether synthetic makes absolutely no difference, they work. And the vitamin B1 is just expensive and may contain things you don't need. So something you can tell your clients, they don't need to spend any money on this. They don't, because plants just don't need it. Okay, and then finally, fertilizer injection. And I've seen some hilarious pictures of this before. We have these guys in white suits and stuff that, have medical-looking things, and they're injecting the soil, and they're injecting the tree. And we're not talking about pesticides here, because that's a whole different thing. This is talking about fertilizers, how you add fertilizers. So for some reason, they say that injecting nutrients is more effective than soil application. So they're injecting it down where the roots are, wherever that may be. But we already know that most fine roots are close to the surface because that's where the water is, that's where the oxygen is, that's where the nutrients come through. So why would you inject this stuff below the fine roots? Injecting it down by the structural roots is going to do absolutely no good. Fine roots and likewise most roots are very close to the soil surface. It's only when you're in areas that have very deep natural soils, like in the Midwest, the grasslands, and you always see pictures of showing these huge deep soils with huge deep roots, and they're always from the Midwest because their soils are different. It turns out the Loess Hills, which are this confluence of all these winds that have taken and blown topsoil and making these huge hills, and it's just pure topsoil. And they've got plants grow there that don't grow anyplace else in the world. But that's not what we're working with. We're working with urban soils that are nothing like the Loess Hills of Iowa. I think it's Iowa. So soils have compacted, impaired urban soils. All the roots are going to be near the soil surface anyway. That's where the nutrients need to come from, is the surface, not beneath them. We also know that trunk injections can hurt the trees. Anytime you breach the protective bark and get into the tree, you're causing potential damage. And that's why we're so careful, why we don't take cores from trees anymore to tell how old they are. I can remember when I was little, and we used to go and do these field trip things where a forester would show how we can tell how old a tree is, and they'd take these big cores out of all kinds of trees. We don't do that because it opens a pathway for disease. Soil injection is just ineffective. It's a waste of resources, a waste of money. It doesn't do what it's marketed to do, and there's no science to ever show that this worked. It's just marketing. Okay, so those are things where there's no science. Then we've got the misapplied science, which includes things like Epsom salts, gypsum, phosphate, and rock dust. And I talked a little bit about the phosphate one before. So I'm going to just briefly go over the first three, and then I'm going to talk about rock dust because that's a weird one. And then there's foliar feeding. So those are things where might be some practical use to them, but not in landscape management, especially not in tree care. So phosphate fertilizer, as I talked about last time, it can be in things like bone meal, it can be triple phosphate, superphosphate, soft phosphate, it's all the same stuff. You're told it enhances root growth, and I'm going to kind of zip through this because I showed you much of this before in terms of the interference with iron uptake and function in the leaves and with manganese as well. More importantly, from our looking at the whole tree, is that too much phosphate in the soil will inhibit mycorrhizae from even becoming integrated with a root system. So for roots to become colonized by mycorrhizae, they have to send out a chemical signal that allows the spores of the fungi to germinate, to send their hyphae over, and to start to colonize the root system. If there's too much phosphate in the soil, the plant doesn't do it. Because even though mycorrhizae are completely beneficial in what they do extract their pay, right? There's always a percentage that you have to pay someone to do something. So mycorrhizae use about 10% of a plant's resources. So if a plant has enough, senses that it has enough of something like phosphate, it doesn't invite the mycorrhizae to become part of its root system. So that's a really bad thing because mycorrhizae do so much more than help take up phosphate. Phosphate also will pollute water systems. Everybody knows that nitrogen is the limiting factor in terrestrial environments, right? We always run out of nitrogen first. In aquatic systems, it's phosphate. The algae use up phosphate faster. So when phosphate comes into a system, all of a sudden, the algae grow. You get the algal blooms. Eventually, they use the phosphate out, and then you get the algal die-off. When they die off, then the bacteria go nuts, breaking down the algae, and the bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water. And that's what kills the fish. So phosphate itself doesn't kill fish, but it creates like low oxygen conditions where the fish can't survive. So again, before you add phosphate, make sure you do a soil test. If a soil test says phosphorus is excessive, don't add anything that contains phosphorus, period. And here's, again, another, this one's not a fact sheet, this is actually peer-reviewed research that we did looking at the effect of phosphate on in this case, rhododendron health. And rhododendron is just it's like a tree, it's a woody plant. Epsom salts turns yellow leaves green. One of those miracle products, again, marketed heavily as Epsom salts because it has that kind of neat spa feeling to it, right? All it is magnesium sulfate, and if you sold as magnesium sulfate, it just wouldn't get purchased because nobody cares. It's a chemical. Oh, we don't like chemicals. We like natural things. So we sell it as Epsom salts. It's rarely deficient in urban soils. There's lots of magnesium in urban soils, enough anyway. And again, we're talking about low levels. It's a micronutrient. And then it makes water feel silkier. So we just think about that and how nice it makes you feel, and then we take that happy, positive feelings and we think that it's good for our plants. I mean, it sounds silly, but this is what we do without really thinking about it. So easy answer, look at the soil test. If your magnesium and your sulfur is within normal values, which this shows you in a normal range, you don't need to add any more. And if you add more, then you're gonna push it into a toxic range. So don't need it. Save it for your feet. This fact sheet on Epsom salt was also co-authored by an extension agent in Idaho. So this was one of our multi-state publications and has great information for managing landscapes in it. And then finally, gypsum. And you're told that gypsum will improve tilth, it loosens clay, and it enhances plant health. And it does in some situations. Again, this is misapplied science. There are reasons we use these things, but not in gardens and landscapes. There's no good application. It's calcium sulfate, so we're just switching calcium from magnesium from the Epsom salts, rarely deficient in urban soils. It is useful in old agricultural soils which have been farmed so hard that they've lost a lot of their tilth, and they may have sodium and other things in this. So also sodic soils can be treated with gypsum because what happens is that the calcium is released and the sodium gets bound up so that you have what's called a sweeter soil. So if you have salty soils, gypsum might be helpful, but only if you have a calcium deficiency. So you have to check the soil test, and if calcium is off scale, then you don't use it, because you have plenty, and adding more gypsum is not going to solve the problem. So you'll see that all of these things have to come back to data, to hard data that you have with soil tests that you can stick right in front of your client's face and say, this soil testing lab knows what you have and knows what you don't need to add. So The fact sheet for that is also out, and a free download for any of your clients that need to be convinced otherwise. So rock dust, this is a weird one, and there's several iterations of this. Rock dust, and then there's sea soil, which is kind of like the rock dust, but it comes from the bottom of the ocean. It's all this sediment stuff that is, you're told that it will improve mineral nutrition for trees. And they all have great names, Gaia Green and, sea soil and all these things that are very nature-loving sounding and just sound like something you want to use. The nice thing is that many of them are registered as fertilizers. So they do have guaranteed analysis, and that's good, because then you can see what they have and what they don't. And as you look at that, what you're going to see is a lot of, one macronutrient and a lot of micronutrients that you probably don't need, plus sodium, and who wants sodium, right? So read these things. There's nothing magical about rock dust. It doesn't have nitrogen, and that's one of the most magical things that plants can get, but there are uses for it. So for instance, if you are making a container media and you need some kind of inorganic compound so that the whole thing doesn't disappear, you have to have some kind of inorganic substrate, rock dust can do that. If you have depleted soils, again, like very heavily used agricultural soils, rock dust might help with that. It depends on the guaranteed analysis. It can improve the structure of soils by adding particulate matter in there. So there are limited uses, but it's not for landscape use. It's really agricultural use. So there is science behind it. What we know of what it doesn't do, it does not increase soil water. There's nothing that would help water bind to it. It's just like any other inorganic component. There's no research on using it in landscapes at all. It can be contaminated with heavy metals, which again, we really don't want to have, and it can have toxic levels of some nutrients. Depends on the source. So it really depends on where this stuff came from and what it contains. So here's another guaranteed analysis, and you can see phosphorus is 3,030 milligrams per kilogram. It's way too high, right? We don't need that much phosphorus. And if you look down there too, we've got heavy metals like zinc, and it's true that plants need some zinc, but you don't need a lot. And zinc in high levels can be toxic. So adding things that you don't need is a really bad idea. So soil tests will tell you what you do need, and unless you're doing one of these very specific agricultural types of uses, I wouldn't bother with any of the rock dust. Foliar feeding is another one of these things that makes no sense when you think about plant physiology. So the soil injection made no sense because it's not it's not going to the fine uptake roots. Foliar feeding is even more egregious because it's telling you that plants don't know any better. If they were really smart, they'd take up their nutrients through their leaves rather than wasting them in the soil. And it's amazing. Plants have been around here so much longer than we have, and they've figured it out. But somehow, apparently, they haven't. So you have people that are applying fertilizer to the leaves of plants rather than the soil. Now, there is a use, again, these things have a limited use. The best use of these things is figuring out and treating nutrient deficiencies. Now, you can't do that on a detached leaf, but let's say you have intervenal chlorosis on some plant, and you're curious, is it iron? Is it manganese? What is it? So you can take a chelate and spray it onto the foliage, see if it changes color. If it changes color, becomes green, then you've identified your deficiency. And then you can look at your soil and figure out, is the soil deficient or is it phosphate? You can start solving these nutrient puzzles. But that's the only thing it can be used for legitimately that does any good or, is helpful to us and doesn't harm the plant. The problem with foliar fertilizer as a treatment to somehow meet all the nutrient needs of your plant is that it's only going to stay in the leaf. Right? The leaves are the most active parts during the growing season. Photosynthesis, sugar transport, all kinds of amino acids there's all kinds of biochemistry going on there. It's not going to just shunt off all of its fertilizer to some other part of the plant. It's going to use it. So that means the roots get nothing, the trunk gets nothing, nothing else gets anything, it's all staying in the leaf. So if you're trying to treat a soil deficiency, spraying a foliar fertilizer is not going to help a soil deficiency. if you think about the size of trees, there's no way that just spraying the leaves are going to somehow support the entire plant, even if they transport any of it out to the rest of the plant, which they generally don't. And if you use it repeatedly, you cause injury to the plants because there are salts in fertilizers, fertilizer salts, and they will accumulate in the tissues and cause marginal and tip necrosis. So there is no good reason to use them except that marketing, that darn marketing. It just convinces you that plants aren't smart enough to do it themselves. And again, think of the size of the tree. Practically, how are you going to spray this tree with fertilizer? Even if it worked, how would you do this? It's silly. It completely throws plant physiology out the window. It's just something you can ignore. So rational nutrient management, which is what we want to hopefully practice. Soil test. So again, soil test from my soil test from somebody else who used compost a lot. Didn't use any kind of boxed or bagged stuff, but uses lots and lots of compost on a regular basis. You know, it's time to add compost because we're ingrained to do that. It's part of our agricultural genetics, right, in terms of how we raise crops. So if you have optimal levels, don't add anything. If you're above optimum, certainly don't add anything, and then figure out if you've got toxicities going on. So the nice thing is you can just not worry about adding fertilizer. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do something, because you do need to maintain the root zone so you have healthy uptake of nutrients that are in the soil. So water, news alert. Water is required for healthy tree growth, for healthy plant growth, period. Add deficient nutrients only, and rely on a soil test to tell you what those are. You can get away with adding nitrogen just about any time. I mean, there are absolutely no scientific studies that have shown a nitrogen toxicity problem under any circumstances. Sure, you can get burning if you apply urea to grass or something, but that's not what we're talking about. Nitrogen itself is not going to cause the problem. A woody mulch will solve a lot of problems. And we'll talk about that. If you're around tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about the landscape underground, and obviously a woody mulch has much to do with that. Knowing that healthy roots make for better nutrient uptake. If your roots are functional and you have sufficient water and nutrients, you're going to have healthy plants. So you want that woody mulch layer to support the mycorrhizal species and other beneficial microbes. So we talk a lot about mycorrhizae. There are also, and we'll talk about tomorrow, probiotics, specifically bacteria that have really important functions at the root level. And that's just something we've started to touch the research on. The mycorrhizae literature is much more robust, but we're getting lots and lots of stuff about beneficial bacteria as well. So some of the resources I have that I invite you to visit. I've got my horticultural myths page, which has been going on, started writing these in 2000, I think. And so there's about 70 of them, and they're just myths about things like we've been talking about today, as well as other things. And all of these URLs are on the bottom of your handout, so you can get to them really easily without too much fussing around. I have all of my research publications on ResearchGate. Are people familiar with ResearchGate? Some people are. Okay, so this is really kind of a resource that researchers use to communicate with each other about what they're doing. So we go on, it's a free site, you have to create a profile, and then you can just upload your papers to share. But other people can get on too. All you have to do is create a profile. It doesn't cost anything. They're not going to market you with junk ads about compost tea or something. But you can get to any researcher's publications that are able to be shared publicly on the site. So I have all my stuff there, my extension articles, my journal articles, everything is there in one place. I have books, and some of you already talked to me out there right next to the raffle table, so when you're drooling over the raffle gifts, if you want to talk to me, I'm there to answer your questions. Plus I've got my books, which include 2 volumes on horticultural myths, a book on plant physiology for gardeners, which that title would have been dead, so we call it How Plants Work instead because it's much more understandable. Sustainable landscapes and gardens. And then if you happen to be a fan of the great courses, I have a series on the great courses. So this is all online, and if you have a membership, you can see thousands of courses that are put on by expert faculty on all different types of topics. So that's where you can find me through web-based and science, print-based things. We also have a blog, which we've been doing since 2009, I guess, where we talk about all types of topics, and we try to publish every week. We're kind of getting rebooted because we lost some people, and other people like myself got distracted last year with other things going on. So anyway, we always try to have new stuff, plus there's an archive going all the way back to 2009. And finally, we have the Garden Professors group, and it's on Facebook, and I know that Facebook may not be everybody's favorite place to be, and I can understand. I'm not going to make any judgments, but we have found it to be a really wonderful place to house a science-based discussion community. And the reason is that we're the only garden group that focuses on science-based information, no anecdotes, no home remedies. We have wonderful administrators. One who's right over here today, who's from Las Cruces, and she's been with me for years and years and years, and they make sure that no one breaks the rules, which is great, so I don't have to be the policeman. I have rabid policemen on this site. So it's a really great place to have discussions about, because people come with questions, we ask for pictures. If you join, you have to answer 3 questions just to make sure you're not a bot, and then you're in. And there's archives going back to 2011. It's a wonderful place to find information. So how many people are already in this group? A few of you? Wonderful. So if you get a chance to talk to other people, if you like it, encourage them. We've got almost 28,000 people. So it's not bad. People from all over the world. I learn new things all the time, because we've got people that are atmospheric scientists, we've got people that are entomologists, things that I'm not, and they contribute so much to this group. So I hope you will join us there, because it really is a good place to learn things and ask questions or share your own experiences. So with that, let's take some questions before you get to break for lunch.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay, I'm marching over there with a mic.
There he is.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could share thoughts on claims that overwatering can rinse the nutrients out of soil.
Okay, that's a good question. I know that with extremely sandy soils, that can be a problem, because the less organic matter you have, the more likely you're going to have nutrients get rinsed out. So sure, it can happen, depending on what your soil content is like. So if you have a decent mulch layer on top, the nice thing about the wood chip mulches is they act like a sponge, and so they absorb water and then they release it. So a lot of, like what I noticed, besides this year when we've had our 100-year flood, where I used to live in Seattle, we were at the bottom of a hill, and that area flooded all the time because we were pretty much next to the wetland of a lake. And it was clay soil. But despite my concerns about that, I went ahead and mulched with the wood chips, and mine turned out to be the only place that never flooded anymore, because the wood chips were able to stop that flooding problem. They absorbed a lot of the water and then released it slowly. The flooded soils were just completely impaired. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying you can manage water much more easily if you have that wood chip mulch layer. It will help you keep water in the soil and not run through it.
Could you touch on the commercial mycorrhiza inoculants that get pushed by a lot of people to introduce them? You know where I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about,
Yeah.
Sylvia. So Sylvia is my administrator that I was talking about before. But yes, the commercial mycorrhizal products, I'll touch on them tomorrow, but they really aren't worth the money. And the reason is because they may not be alive, number one. That was what some of the early research looking at the products looked at, was, are these things even alive? And so they had a microbiology lab, and they plated everything out, and most of the stuff was dead. So no, those don't work. So then if you're going to use them, you have to have a certain leap of faith that they're going to work, because they're alive. And then the second issue is that many of them are not native species to wherever you are, which is not surprising. And this initially was a concern because, of course, we're worried about bringing in non-natives and having them take over, whatever it is, in this case, the soil environment. So there was some really great work that looked at the mycorrhizal inoculants, where they inoculated half the trees, planted them, the other ones were not inoculated, they all got planted out, and they were left for a year. Now, most of the time, these are kind of fast things where they just see whether they get inoculated or not. This was for a whole year, and when they pulled them up, they found that the ones that had been inoculated, well, first of all, they found that everything was inoculated, and that even the ones that were treated with inoculant were not inoculated with those species, but with the native species. So whatever is in your soil right now with trees is whatever's going to do best in your conditions. So what I was saying kind of flippantly for years is just take a handful of soil from underneath your existing trees and shrubs and sprinkle it around. Now you'll find researchers that actually use that in their recommendations, but in a much more scientific way. Not really, but just, suggesting that you just use what's already there as the inoculant and just let nature do its thing.
We have 2 virtual questions.
Okay, thanks. One question from Chris online. Soil tests make sense as a great diagnostic tool. What are your thoughts regarding sap analysis?
Oh, the bricks question, right? I'm assuming it's the bricks thing. If you are making wine or doing something else that requires looking at sugars and things like that, bricks and all that type of analysis is great. Sap analysis is another one of those things that sounds so scientific, which it is, but it has absolutely no application to anything that we do. So I think it's, unless you are concerned about looking at the amount of sugar in some beverage that you might happen to be making, that I wouldn't ever spend money on it.
Thank you. Okay, and then also George asked, do you have insight on silicone application for cold hardiness improvement?
That's a great question. It's something I've now just started looking into because there is research now looking at silicone, which is, this is what happens with essential nutrients, right? When I first started my plant studies back in the 1980s, we had 15 recognized essential nutrients. And that number has gone up as we've identified more and more things that are needed in very small quantities. And silicone is one of those things. Now, we knew silicone was important for things like grasses, but now appears to be important for other plants as well in terms of their general environmental hardiness. So yes, there is some legitimacy to that. How well it works in terms of applying it in the field, I don't know yet, because I'm not really seeing a lot of field research yet. It's more now just kind of the hard science analyzing exactly what it does.
Question in the back.
I have a question about, field trees are dug up, and so they're always nurseries sending their soil away, and they're replacing that soil with manure and wood chips and all these other things. Do you know of any studies of the effects of tilling in clean industrial hemp?
Okay, I haven't had that question before. For ag production, which is really what this is, it's a longer term ag production, but it is ag production. It makes sense. If you've given away you've sent away all your soil, which is just unthinkable in my mind anyway why you would do that, but I know it happens. Then you have to replace it with something, can't replace it with soil, and so you do use the organic compounds to make a lighter mix for one thing. So the short answer would be I don't see any problem with using any kind of clean residue from a crop.
We have a question here.
What's your take on the use of wood ash and also biochar to facilitate mycorrhizal connections and kind of the recent research on that and it helping shoot growth and root growth?
Good question. So the wood ash itself I looked into several years ago, and there's so many problems with it in terms of having some pretty high levels of things we don't want, especially some metals, that I'd never recommend using wood ash itself. But biochar is one of those interesting things that years ago, when it first came out, and I saw the name biochar, I hate stuff that is eco-dash or bio-dash. It just screams marketing to me. But I decided to wait till the science came out, and there's some really excellent science on biochar. thousands of papers. The problem is it doesn't have a whole lot of really practical application to much of what we do. It works well, for instance, as part of a mix in tree wells and things like that, where you have limited soil volume, because it does provide this, it's kind of like little puffed pieces of pumice. So it provides this very aerated environment for mycorrhizae and other beneficial microbes. It's kind of like condos, it's kind of like micro condos. And so it's actually really beneficial in a lot of ways. The downside is there's not a whole lot of practical application. As I mentioned, tree wells, part of a container mix. Green roofs, I think, would be a great place to use it. I don't know if anyone's used it in part of a green roof mix. So in limited things, but you can't just like work it into the soil and expect it to make a difference, because it creates textural imbalances anyway, and I haven't seen anything that suggests that that's going to work very well.
We have time for one more question. Going once. Oh, right here.
What is your take on the no-till method that's becoming popular now, and just laying compost and stuff on the top of the ground instead of working it
Lasagna
in?
gardening, right?
Pardon me?
Lasagna gardening? No, just compost? No cardboard. Well, that's good. So I don't have to rant about cardboard anymore. With the compost, the main problem is, well, there's two main problems. One is it's very finely textured, and so it's very hard for water and oxygen to get through it into the soil. The second thing is it's pretty nutrient rich, and it can be a source of seeds, weed seeds. So I love having compost being part of an application. So let's say you're working with, soils that are low nutrient in the first place, which I'm sure you all run into. So if you put maybe an inch of compost down and then put the wood chips on top, that would be great. And then the cool thing about wood chips is as they break down, they create their own compost layer. So you only have to do it once, and then the wood chips just create the compost as they decompose.